You know, I know we celebrated Christmas about 3 weeks ago, but the words of a Christmas song made popular by Dean Martin, which more recently enjoyed a resurgence of popularity because of the bathroom scene in the movie Elf. The words of that song comes to mind. A lot of you know what I'm talking about. It's the words, "Baby, it's cold outside." I mean, it is definitely cold outside. I checked. We've not set a record low. The record low for today is 9 below. But we came close. We got to 6 below. So it's definitely cold. And for those of you who came out for this morning's service, what can I say to you? Your being here has convinced me of 2 things. You're brave, and you're a little bit crazy. No, seriously, I do very much appreciate those of you who braved the elements that came out this morning. And for those of you who, would have liked to have been here this morning, but for health or safety reasons, you stayed home, and you're watching this online. Let me just say I appreciate your watching this online this morning. Today we're beginning a new sermon series titled simply, I Am. And this is a sermon series which we're going to be in between now and it's going to take us all the way up to Easter. And what we're going to be doing in this series is we are going to be looking at some of the I Am, several of the I Am statements that God said. We're going to start things off today by looking at the I am that I am response that God gave to Moses when Moses asked God to tell him his name. That statement's found in the 3rd chapter of the book of Exodus. I encourage you to open a Bible or a Bible app to that chapter. If you don't have an app on your phone, you don't have a Bible with you, we do have some Bibles scattered throughout the auditorium underneath some of the chairs there. While you're doing that, while you're looking for Exodus chapter 3 in the scriptures, I'll just tell you about something that caught my attention a few years back. I had went to my local bank. The name's bank, by the way, has changed the names 3 times since I've lived here. So I can't tell you exactly what the name of the bank was at the time. I can tell you it was located at the corner of Frank Scott Parkway and Greenmount. Anyway, I went inside, I did some banking, and when I came out, I noticed some smoke rising up from some of the landscaping out front. Just kind of, wispy smoke coming up. And not the kind of thing you expect to see when you're coming out of the bank. And if memory serves me right, I sat down in my car and I just sat there for a couple of moments and watched. And saw that smoldering, landscape material and the smoke. And then suddenly, the next thing you know, a bush there caught on fire. And I don't think that was all started by a cast-aside cigarette butt. It had been very dry. It had been very hot. I think the fire really was the result of some type of spontaneous combustion, some maybe decomposition of the landscape materials. Anyway, it wasn't a big blaze. It was just a small flame. So I investigated, kind of went over and looked at it a little bit. And then I went inside and reported the burning bush to an employee. and of course, they took care of the situation. Now, I shared that story with you because it has something in common with today's scripture story. In both stories, there's an investigation of an unusual burning bush situation. However, my experience with a burning bush at the bank and Moses' experience with the burning bush at Mount Oreb, they are worlds apart. Exodus chapter 3 begins this way. Now, Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Oreb, the mountain of God. And there the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within the bush. By the way, whenever you're reading the Old Testament scriptures, you come across that little phrase, the angel of the Lord. Not an angel of the Lord, but the angel of the Lord. I really understand that to be an appearance by Jesus before he became a human being. But anyway, it says, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within the bush. And Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. And so Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight. Why the bush does not burn up. Okay, I think it's important that we kind of review some of the events which took place in Moses' life, prior to this moment that kind of set up this moment so we can better appreciate what happens in the midst of this burning bush moment. Moses, at this point in his life, I understand, he's 80 years old. He has spent the last 40 years of his life living as a shepherd. His daily routine for the last 4 decades pretty much consisted of watching and tending sheep. Now, the last 40 years of his life, they were very, very different from the first 40 years of his life. The first 40 years of his life was spent living in luxury, for he had been adopted into the house of Pharaoh. Most of you know the story of Moses. You know that at the time when Moses was born, the Hebrews were slaves to the Egyptians, and how at that particular point in history that the Pharaoh had commanded the Hebrew women to throw their newborn sons into the river. Well, Moses' mother refused to do that. Instead, for the first few months of his life, she hid him. But as he got a little stronger, a little bigger, his voice became a little louder, I think, she became, I believe, afraid that someone would hear him crying and that they would notify the Egyptians, and the Egyptian soldiers would just be alerted and they'd come and they'd kill her baby. So she came up with a different idea. She said, I got to approach this differently. She came up with this plan, and she puts Moses in a basket. She puts the basket in the river. And I believe she did it very purposefully in such a way that he would be discovered. I think her hope was that whoever found him would take pity on him, that they'd feel sorry for him. And her plan worked. Moses was found. And the person who found him and felt for him and decided she would raise him as her own child turns out to be that person's Pharaoh's daughter. So Moses becomes instantly the adopted grandchild of Pharaoh. And he's raised in Pharaoh's home. Growing up, I think he probably was pampered and spoiled and lived a life of luxury. I think he enjoyed, a position of royal power. People weren't going to mess with him because, hey, his grandpa's the Pharaoh, One day, Moses as an adult, he sees an Egyptian taskmaster mistreating a Hebrew slave. And at some point of observing it, something inside of him just snapped. And he ended up killing that taskmaster. He attempted to cover up, but he was found out. And as news of what he did was spreading, Moses decided the best thing for him to do was to hightail it out of Egypt. Long story shorter, he ends up becoming a shepherd in the desert. And 40 years later, on a routine day of shepherding, doing routine shepherd things, he sees this unusual sight of this burning bush. Now, I don't think it was unusual for Moses to see a bush on fire in the desert. I would imagine over the course of the years, he'd probably seen dozens of those types of fires. But a bush that was on fire that wasn't being consumed by the fire, that was an unusual thing for him to see. And so he went over and he investigated. And as he goes over to investigate, suddenly, without warning, totally unexpectedly, a voice comes from the midst of the fire. And the voice speaks to him. And it's the voice of God. Let's read on. Chapter 3, we're ready for verse 4. It says, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush. So again, the angel of the Lord there is God, right? God called to him from within the bush. Moses. Or if you watch the movies, Moses. And Moses said, here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you're standing is holy ground. And then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. And at this, Moses hid his face because he was afraid to look at God. And the Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I'm concerned about their suffering. And so I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, and Amorites, Pezerites, and Hivites, and Jebusites, anybody else you might think up. But he says, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me. And I've seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. And so now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Verse 11, but Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Moses asking God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt, was just another way, I think, for him to say, whoa. Wait a minute now. You know who you're talking to, right? You know, I was raised in the house of Pharaoh. You do know I've been living out here in the wilderness all these years because I'm a wanted man back there in Egypt. You know all that. You know I killed an Egyptian. I think you got the wrong man for the job. Let's read on. Picking up verse 12. God said, I'll be with you, and this will be a sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And then Moses did something that I'm glad he did because of the response that he got. Moses asked God to tell him his name. Verse 13. Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and I say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they ask me, well, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. Now that's New International Version. Some other versions of the Bible, which I prefer the other way because I grew up with King James, you know. I am that I am. He says, this is what you are saying to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Now, the conversation between God and Moses, it goes on for several more verses. But I want us to stop here this morning because I want our focus to be on God's I am who I am name and not everything else that took place in this conversation. Moses asked God to tell him his name. And God answers him telling Moses that his name is I am that I am, or I am who I am. Depending upon the translation to read. God told Moses, this I am that I am name. This is my name forever. The name you shall call me from generation to generation. What's God's name? His name is I am. I am that I am. That I am that I am name of God, friends, it's made up of 4 letters, 4 consonants in the Hebrew language. If we were to write them out in our English alphabet, we'd write the 4 letters YHWH. The ancient Hebrews, who are also known as the Jews or the Israelites, folks, they had so much respect for that I am name of God, that Yahweh name of God, that YHWH name of God, that they wouldn't even speak it. They would not speak it for fear of misusing it or mispronouncing it. And so whenever they came across that YHWH, that we'll call it Yahweh, that Yahweh name of God in the Scriptures, which appears, by the way, a lot of times, more than 4,000 times in the Old Testament. Whenever they would come across that name, they wouldn't say it. But instead of attempting to say it or saying that name, they would say a different name for God. They would usually use the word Adonai. Or maybe they might use one of the El Shaddai names of God, one of the El names of God. But that I am name, they just respected it so much that they wouldn't even speak it. I also learned that when the scribes were writing out the Scriptures, copying the Scriptures, this has been a time long before copy machines and, pictures and all that kind of stuff and printing presses. They had to hand copy stuff. And when they would get ready to hand copy this name of God, when they came to that point in the Scriptures, whoever the scribe was who was doing it, he would stop. And he would get up, get this, because he didn't want to mishandle the name. He would go and take a bath. And then he would wash his pen before he would write the name. And I was thinking about that. I thought, in those couple of verses right there, it looks like the guy would have had 3 baths in the course of about 45 minutes. It's incredible. But that's what they did. So much respect for the name of God. Society, even friends, Christians, man, so many have moved such a long, long ways from the respect that the ancient Hebrews had for God's name. Because we not only hesitate to pronounce and sing the name Yahweh these days, but some people, many people, and even some Christians will thoughtlessly employ the names of God and Lord and Jesus Christ into their profanities. Now, about that I am name of God, friends, it reveals a lot of things about God. First and foremost, it reveals to us that God exists. God is. God told Moses, I am that I am is my name. I am. That's God's name. I love the comments that Dr. Mark Barber makes about God's I am name. He says this, I am is the shortest sentence imaginable, a simple subject and verb of being. We want to supply some sort of descriptive adjective in the predicate, but all descriptors are also limiters. By using them, we make God to be less than he really is. God, by his grace, allows limiters so that we who are limited can come to some sort of understandings about him, but we must be aware that by supplying predicate adjectives, we're not saying all that can be said about God. God is always I am. He went on to reason that even if we were to add 100 other things about God to that I am sentence, such as love, I am light, I am just, I am kind, I am holy, so on and so forth. He says, even if we were to add 100 of them or more, he says, we'd still not be able to say everything about him. Understand this, if you will, about Moses, okay? As I said, he was raised in Pharaoh's house. And so he was no doubt exposed to the various gods that the Egyptians worshipped. But all of the Egyptian gods, which really weren't gods at all, they were, in the eyes of the Egyptians, limited gods. And what I mean by that is each Egyptian god was believed to be capable of exercising power, but only in a particular area. One of the Egyptian gods would have been the god of the Nile. Another Egyptian god was the god of good crops. Another Egyptian god was their god of war. And on and on. The Egyptians had all these different gods, but all of them were limited. And when God revealed his name to Moses, God was in essence making Moses aware that all of those Egyptian gods that he had learned about with all of their limitations, they really weren't gods. In revealing to Moses his I am that I am name, God was making Moses aware that he is the one and only true God, and there is no other. By the way, I think it's also important for us to wrap our minds around the fact that this I am that I am name of God carries with it the ideas not only that God exists in the here and now, but that God has always existed and God will always exist. It might be helpful for us to think of God's I am name in the sense that in that name, God is saying, I was who I was. I am who I am, and I will be who I will be. Now, what that means, you see, is not only that God exists, but his name means he is eternal. He's always existed. He exists right now. He will go on existing forever. And you know what that means? It means everything else in existence has only come into existence because he has either created it or allowed it. Speaking of this idea, John Piper said, God is who he is. Or to say it more philosophically, God absolutely is. He writes, this is the most basic fact and the most ultimate fact, period. Of the billions of facts that there are, this is the one at the bottom and at the top. It is the foundation of all the others and the consummation of all others. Nothing is more basic and nothing is more ultimate than the fact that God is. Nothing is more foundational, he writes, to this church than that God is. Nothing is more foundational to your life or your marriage or your job or your health or your mind or your future than this. God is. Nothing is more foundational to the world or the solar system, the Milky Way, or the universe than that God is. And nothing is more foundational to the Bible and to the self-revelation of God and the glory of the gospel of Jesus than that God is. There's a whole lot more. There's a whole lot more that we're going to come to grasp over the course of the next several weeks as we look, into many of the other I am statements that God made. But for us to understand and appreciate and grasp the meaning and the extent, you see, of all of those other I am statements we're going to be looking at, friends, we've got to get this one first. Like Piper said, it is foundational. If we do not believe God is, if we do not believe that God exists, friends, then none of the other statements that we're going to be looking at will matter or be of any help to us. And so this brings us to the challenges and the takeaways from today's scripture, from today's I am that I am statement, which God spoke and claimed is his name forever. The first challenge is, I think, is pretty obvious. It is, of course, to believe that God exists. Now, seeing who's come out this morning, I doubt that's a struggle for any of you. I believe you're here exactly because you do believe God exists. But the reality is, I don't know what's going on in any of your hearts no more than you know what's going on in mine. And like the old saying goes, sitting in church no more makes you a Christian than sitting in the garage makes you a car. I don't know your heart, but you know it. And God knows it. If you do believe that God exists, awesome. Hang in there with me for the second challenge, which is soon to follow. But if you're here today, and if you're here today, and it appears to all of us that you believe, but you know in your heart you really don't believe, I challenge you to challenge your unbelief. And that challenge, by the way, to challenge your unbelief goes for anybody who might be watching this online. I challenge you. If at this point in your life you don't believe, I challenge you to seriously look at your reasons for choosing not to believe or choosing not to look into spiritual things if you've not been doing that. If when you look seriously at your reasons for not believing and you realize it's because you've been influenced by a particular person or some particular set of teachings or some event that's led your heart and mind towards unbelief, I encourage you, I would plead with you, please rethink the matter. Rethink it. And instead of approaching faith and this idea that God exists, which I believe is the truth, instead of approaching it, with a closed mind, that thinks there must not be a loving God, because if there wasn't a loving God, he wouldn't have let things turn out the way they did in my life and this or that particular thing. I would encourage you to approach it with an open mindset. A mindset that says, if a loving God does exist, and it's obvious he doesn't do things the way I thought he would. And so I ought to be looking into this. Instead of rejecting it, I would challenge you to say, you know what? I should look more deeply into this. And the reason I challenge you to challenge your unbelief is, friends, we're talking about eternity. We're talking about eternity. Now, the second challenge, the second takeaway I see for us in this I am that I am name of God is for us to accept God for who he is. Now, friends, that is so much easier said than done. Because the reality is the I am that I am name of God means exactly that God is who he is. He's nothing more. He's nothing less. And it means that God is going to continue being who he is, even though you or I might think or might wish he was something different. What we're talking about is the fact that God being who he is, he may tell us things at times we don't want to know. He may sometimes say to us things we don't want to hear. He may say no to us when we really want him to say yes. He may tell us to go somewhere that we do not want to go. He may tell us to do something we don't want to do. He may tell us to deal with our past when we would simply rather forget it and move on. He may pull our children or our grandchildren into ministry or some distant mission field when we would rather see them, enter a medical field because it's more lucrative, or we would rather see them, work somewhere locally so we can see them more easily and more often. Here's something to think about as you consider the scripture passage that we've just looked at. And I encourage you to go home and read further into this story in the book of Exodus. But here's something I want you to think about. We saw this today. God called Moses to do something that Moses really didn't want to do, and he felt incapable of doing. We also saw in this, God didn't answer the Hebrews' prayers for deliverance immediately. 40 years has passed, we know of, since Moses left Egypt. And I didn't go back into it. I don't remember how many years before that they were slaves. But again, God didn't answer the Hebrews' prayers for deliverance immediately. Rather, he allowed the Hebrews to live in slavery for many, many years before freeing them. And God did all of those things and more, and yet understand God was God the entire time. He didn't change. He didn't waver. He didn't suddenly gain power to be able to release them. And I'm telling you these things because I have seen people, through my many years of ministry, I have seen people who initially had no trouble in believing that God exists, but who later struggled with believing that God exists, or they turned to disbelief because their faith in God was destroyed, because instead of believing in the one true God who does exist, they believed, friends, in a God of their own making. Let me tell you something, folks. We set ourselves up for spiritual disillusionment and even spiritual failure when we fail to accept God for who he is. And here's the thing. The one true, real God, friends, he's better. Infinitely better than any God that you or I might create or think up in our own minds. He's not something less. He is something infinitely more. So much more, you see, that we're only hurting ourselves and we're only imprisoning our own souls and our own futures when we reject God because we think better than he does the kind of God he ought to be. And third, and the final challenge I'm going to pull from this morning's scripture passage is this. And it's the challenge for you and me to be obedient. To be obedient to God's call on our life. To be obedient on God's call on our life in whatever way or form that may be given to us at this point in our life. None of us knows right now. We have no idea, really, of the calling God may have in mind to give us at some point in the future. But I think if we're looking, and if we're listening, and if we're honest with ourselves and with him, we can hear his call on our life right now. His call may be for you to continue being a great stay-at-home mom that raises the kids to know Jesus. His call may be for you to remain faithful to your spouse. His call may be for you to give up an addiction. His call may be for you to keep on praying for a friend or a family member. His call may be for you to join a small group. His call may be for you to get back to attending worship on a regular basis. His call may be for you to reach out to your neighbor and invite him or her to church. Whatever his call is on your life at this moment, I encourage you to be obedient to it. And friends, if you believe, if what you believe is God's call, is in fact God's call, understand this, God will do for you what he did for Moses. He will provide for you all that is necessary. to carry out that call. Another minister in his sermon claimed that, and I'm going to go ahead and ask the worship team to come back as I share this last illustration. Another minister in his sermon on this name of God claimed that in the ancient Near East, people took off their sandals for two reasons. One, when they were invited into the tent of a friend, and two, when they were required to do it by a conquering enemy. You see, without sandals, the enemy could not run away into the rugged desert and escape. And then the minister who shared that said, this raises a very perplexing question. It raises the questions, what is God like? Is he a loving God who's ready to enter into a close relationship and be a friend to us? Or is he a holy God who says we're unholy people and therefore we have to surrender to him? And the minister answered that series of questions this way. It's clear God's both. He is loving and he is holy. And to take off your shoes, he writes, means you are ready to lay down your conditions. Notice he says, God didn't say, I'll meet you and then you can decide if you want to take off your shoes. No, he said, take off your shoes and then we'll meet. And he said, you and I have to say, God, I believe who you say you are. I'm yours. And I'll follow. I'm going to invite you.